So Melanie Brooks, thanks so much for being here. I really am eager to talk to you about your two books, one a memoir and one a book about memoirs.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. It's great to
Yeah,
chat.
yeah, and you've written two books as I mentioned. One is a memoir, A Hard Silence, about how your father, who was a surgeon in Canada, contracted AIDS through the infected blood supply
Hmm.
at the
Yeah.
time, and how that was kept a secret and how you negotiated that and your latest book writing hard stories is about how 18 memoirists tell their
Right.
own
And it
tell the,
actually goes the opposite direction. So the writing hard stories was first, and
that was first. Okay,
yeah, a hard silence was second. Yeah.
great, thanks for making
You're
that
welcome.
distinction.
You're welcome. Well, because I always talk about writing hard stories as kind of the pathway I needed to get to being able
Great.
to write the memoir.
Yeah, I didn't check the copyright date, so I just thanks for making that distinction.
You're welcome.
um so in the memoir by Sue William Silverman, Because I Remember Terror, you write, it's not an easy book to read.
Mhm.
And so, can you talk about what's hard about writing a memoir of trauma and also reading one? How
Sure.
that's hard for you. This whole issue of hard keeps coming up.
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, I mean, certainly, you know, when you read other people's stories that are traumatic stories that can have triggering effects for people. And I never demand that, memoir topics be required reading for other people, right? I mean, I think that in some ways we as readers have a responsibility to bear witness to some of the atrocities that people face and to
Right.
to walk with them through those journeys, but also the recognition. I mean, it's particularly with Sue, what I write about is, it's a story of childhood sexual abuse, and it's very difficult to read, and yet you're with Sue after the fact. And so you're also with the survivor of that trauma and the wisdom she's earned, through working through that trauma. And so I think that there's certainly, a sense that readers could be traumatized by certain topics in memoir. And I think that's why, we make choices as readers of what we're able to read and what we're not able to read. And certainly as a writer, I don't expect that, my memoir is for everyone, no. There's a lot of grief in my memoir, and a lot of people don't like walking in that territory of grief, but I think we are, as memoirists, we're writing those stories for the people who are looking for companionship through those
Right.
stories, right?
That's right. It's really about connection, connecting to what's really common and ordinary. I mean, life can be traumatic, I think, if you live long enough, unless you're living under some bubble.
Right. Well, yeah, right.
You're
And
gonna
I mean,
experience
a
loss.
lot of a lot of memoirs contain very unique circumstances, right?
Right.
That don't happen to everyone, but a lot of the emotional turmoil is not unique, right? Feelings of loss or fear or grief, those are feelings we all feel at various points in our experiences. And to have somebody who can articulate those and also articulate how they coped with those things, I think can be really helpful for a reader as well.
What draws you or what drew you to stories of trauma,
I
memoirs
think
of trauma?
I've always been someone who leans into emotionally heavy material, not just as a reader, but just as a person. I've always whereas there are certain personalities, I think, who back away
Mhm.
from things. I've just always been somebody who leans in. I feel things very deeply. I feel other people's pain very deeply. And I think I connect very deeply to stories of trauma. And I think because, a lot of my story is a story of dealing with, some very traumatic experiences in deep isolation, I always have been seeking out that companionship. And so I think that's part of it. I wanted to read how initially, I started reading memoir just because I wanted to read how other people, like I said, were kind of coping with the world, right? How do they cope with kind of the things that happen to us? And then as I began writing it, I wanted to read how other people shaped their stories and how did they put these stories on the page in an artful, creative way that made other people drawn to them.
Yeah, you said something that really struck me about the idea that you lean into these stories
Mhm.
naturally, that you are drawn to the emotions and the lessons that are learned. And in your introduction, you highlight the tension in literary communities around expressing real emotion, in particular, where there's a lot of sensitivity, personal topics. There seems to be this unspoken discomfort
Mhm.
with, and even disdain towards overly, overtly emotional or traumatic writing, which in some literary worldview is considered less than true literature.
Sure.
And I was wondering if you thought about the question, does this attitude reveal a gender bias in literature that hard stories with strong emotions, even when told by men, are somehow, quote, too female or
Well,
too.
I mean, I think that there is some level of gender bias if you just look at the genre of memoir and you look at the man-sized hole in it, that the percentage of writers who are writing memoir who are female
Yeah,
versus the percentage of writers who are male writing memoir. There's been a lot of studies done about, how women will read books by both men and women, but men only read books by men. I
right.
don't know all the statistics, but I think that there's, memoir as a genre has kind of had to claw its way in to the literary world in some ways because I think it's kind of been classified as a lot of different things, therapeutic writing or self-indulgent writing or navel gazing, all of these things that kind of say, you know, putting your personal life on display is something you shouldn't do, right? It kind of is speaking to that idea. And yet then we've had some amazing memoirists who have stepped into the literary world with their stories and that, and proven that it's not just about the story, it's also about the writing. But I do think that there's a gender bias, and I think there's a gender bias, particularly when it comes to memoir. And I don't, not necessarily that men aren't writing memoir. If you look, I have 18 writers, nine of them in the book are men that have written memoirs. But I was at a writing conference, a creative nonfiction writing conference. It was like a 3 or 4 day writing conference a few weeks ago, and it was all women. And the author, Bill Rohrbach, came and spoke, and he said, I know the answer to this, but he said, where are all the men? And then he described, however, that he was just on book tour in Italy, and it was such a different story, that, you know, men are just as involved in kind of the literary realm as women are. And you don't see that very large percentage of women attending book talks and men not. And so I think it might be particularly an American or a North American thing as well. But then you look at things like, the expectations on men for writing memoir, and kind of what the bias is toward men. Like, the big reviews come out for the men who've written, rising out of kind of toxic masculinity, or like those stories get a lot of attention, and sometimes the stories that aren't about that written by men don't, so I think that I mean, we are a society that shies away from, deep self-reflection and shies away from authentic and honest and vulnerable feelings being on display, right? We celebrate the people who are stoic in the face of loss. We
Hmm.
talk about people's strength to keep it together, when bad things happen. And I think that's doing a disservice to kind of the authentic experience of a lot of those things. I think what memoirists are trying to do is change that narrative, because I think the more authentic we are with how experiences make us feel, but also our ability to articulate and create art out of those experiences, I think kind of the nicer society, a kinder society, hopefully we can create.
Yeah, and you're Canadian,
Mhm.
um, and you're living in the U.S. So
Yes.
I'm glad you brought up the multicultural aspect, the multicultural differences, because that's exactly what I was going to ask you was, are there multicultural differences? I have to admit, I love watching that series, The Crown,
Mhm.
in which it's all about stoicism,
Right.
in service of protecting the crown. If we admit
Right.
vulnerability, somehow the monarchy will be in danger. So that seems to be so much cooked into North American culture, excluding Mexico from that for a moment. So yeah, it really does make me wonder about the multicultural aspects of
Right.
what kinds of
Yeah, I
memoir
mean,
really
Bill
value.
talked about just, kind of going from event to event and just,
Where the man.
the absolute involvement of kind of everybody who was there in Italy. And but he also talked about how, Italian men are much more open with their feelings and their expressions of their feelings. And, so I do think that there's a cultural difference that plays into it for sure.
Yeah, having grown up in such a family, the emotions were often, in the forefront of a conversation,
Mhm.
and it made me want to gravitate towards a more stoic approach,
Right, right.
of life, to
My
kind
friend
of
Mary,
calm things down.
Yeah, my friend Mary Ann Leone, who I interviewed for Writing Hard Stories, has said to me, I could have used a balance of your parents' silence, and you could have used a balance of, us
Yeah,
saying everything that was on our minds, like they're finding a good balance in between those two things.
that's fascinating how memoirs can really serve that purpose, and then popularizing them as well. Um, you start the Mary Leon chapter by talking about your anxiety about meeting her.
Mhm.
Um, and that quote for the thousandth time, you tell yourself to be cool, to just be yourself. So it made me wonder, how do you prepare yourself to do the interviews? Were some writers scarier for you to interview than others?
Well, I
Maybe.
mean, Marianne was partly because, she's a celebrity in her own right, and her
Mhm.
husband is an Academy Award winning actor, and I was going to their home, and yet they're also just people who have a very difficult story of having lost their son, and so I think I had to remind myself, that we have kind of this celebrity idea. I mean, I did get to talk to some New York Times bestselling authors who, at the time when I was just kind of an emerging writer myself, I hadn't published. And, so I kind of had starry eyes about a lot of these writers I had the opportunity to talk to. But I think what the experience of talking to all these writers taught me was, kind of that literary mystique that we kind of put on people is really overall something we're putting on them. It's not necessarily who they are. I think the bigger thing for me in preparing to talk to these writers was that I really wanted to know their stories well. It
Mhm.
felt really important that I went into these interviews both having deep familiarity with the books that they'd written, but also really understanding who they were,
Mhm.
as people. And
Yeah,
so that was a lot of my prep.
yeah, it made me wonder, who got into your list and who did you exclude and for what reasons?
Well, so, you know, I always talk about writing hard stories as kind of an accidental book because I didn't set out to write it as a book. I was in the middle of my Master's of Fine Arts program. I was working on my creative thesis, which eventually became my memoir. Um, and I had to do a project kind of midway through my Master's of Fine Arts, and it had to be more kind of a critical analysis, or something less related to the creative work that we were doing. But I decided to kind of take a very selfish approach, because for me, digging into the difficult territory of my memories and my family's experience was completely different than what I had expected it to be. It was a lot more painful than I thought. I was doing it 20 years after the fact, so I didn't think that the emotional tension of it would be quite as large as it was. And I really wanted to know if that was, if I was an outlier in that way, and I started kind of by reading interviews with other writers and asking, wondering if I could find the answer. Like, am I normal? Is this normal? But nobody was asking them the questions that I wanted to ask them. And so I decided, maybe for this project, I could interview a couple of writers. I would approach a couple of writers, and then I could interview them and I could write an article. And so I initially was approaching writers whose books I had read, for my program. As part of our MFA program, we had to read 2 books in our genre a month and reflect on those. And so I was going specifically to the writers whose books I had just read and that had resonated with me. And so that's how it started. And, I realized as I started these interviews, and first of all, kind of reached out to a bunch of writers thinking a couple would respond. They all responded, and they all responded very generously, not just like send
Mm.
me a few questions. It was, come and let's have lunch, or come to my house, or come walk dogs in the Hamptons with me, or, it was all these amazing experiences. And I realized I couldn't just write an article where I just put a quote in, and
Right.
so I just gradually, kind of that semester, I was writing them up as profiles, that I was just kind of writing them, and I would send them to my faculty mentor, and she kept writing back and saying, this is a chapter of a book. Oh, look, this is another chapter of your book. And I was really reticent about that, because I was already working on the memoir. But when I graduated from my MFA, I kind of had these 2 projects, and I had done, I think, 9 or 10 of the interviews that end up being the 18 interviews in writing her stories. And so I decided from there that I would pursue that as a book project. And part of my decision making, when I initially started, because I wasn't thinking of book, I wasn't thinking about diversity, I wasn't thinking of,
Mm.
wanting to have a broad range of voices at the time, just because I wasn't thinking book, but knowing that it was going to become a book, then it became kind of some purposeful choices on including a range of diversity with the writers. But one of the things that was important to me was that I wasn't just choosing a writer because they were a writer of color, or because they were a writer from a different economic background than I was from. I still wanted to have the sense that their book resonated with the story I was trying to tell. And so that's where it came from. I just read a lot of memoirs, and chose
Mm.
the writers whose books had such deep impacts on me, that I really wanted to talk to them about it.
What kinds of impacts? Can you be specific or say more
Well,
about
I
that?
mean,
What really drew you? Yeah.
I remember when I read, Joan Wickersham's The Suicide Index, for example, and she wrote about her father's suicide. And that book, if you're looking for a non-traditional memoir structure, that's a beautiful example of a book that does that. So she writes about her father's suicide, and she actually structures the book in the form of a standard index, so it's like suicide, day of, suicide, mom's version. And, like, so it kind of, it
It's
goes in,
cinematic.
it's right. And
Yeah.
it's amazing. And
Mm.
it was a runner-up for the National Book Award. And
Mm.
when I read that book, it gave me a certain level of permission of, okay, I don't have to write this story, this is the beginning, then this happens, then this happens, and then this happens. It kind of gave me permission to look at the pieces of my story in a different way. And, so in that way, like when I read, Edwidge Danticat's book about her uncle's death in detainment when he was trying to immigrate to the United States, I just felt the pain of that family. And, it was a complete medical crisis that was overlooked that happened to him in her book, Brother, I'm Dying. And I just felt the grief and the loss and the unfairness of that, and that resonated at the level of my story as well. And so every single story kind of had something, whether it was a thread of grief or whether it was, you know, family dynamics or anything along those lines that just kind of felt like I can see myself in these stories and I see and that's kind of what's amazing about memoir because obviously I know nothing about Edwidge Danticat's family from Haiti and and yet I could imagine myself in that scenario.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes me wonder. So the process of writing hard stories. Well, it sounds like it did start somewhat uh, in your MFA program, but I also wondered about you as a diarist. Did you ever keep a diary
I
when you were
didn't.
growing up? You did not,
No, I mean, I think I probably had a few of those, like with the little lock and key we had
right?
back in the 80s. Um, but I think I was I've never been one of those people who can keep a standard journal, and there are times when I will journal and I will write things, but it never like a day-to-day kind of diary for me. So no, I didn't. But like the reason I needed to talk to these writers was really to understand that, when we write these kind of stories, it is a painful experience and it is, it does leave us feeling like, it's too much and it's overwhelming. But at the same time, all of them had done it and gotten to the place where they'd published their books. And I really wanted to know what it was like to kind of get to that other side too. And so those parts of the conversations were the things that were most encouraging to me because they kept telling me, you will get to a place where this gets easier. And at the time I was interviewing them, I didn't necessarily feel that way about my book, about my story, but the more they said it, and every single one of them said it, the more I kind of latched on to that belief. And I did eventually come to that place where it did get easier and I was able to recognize where I was headed with the story and what the value of it and why I was writing it.
Yeah. So yeah. So the writers that you were drawn to were people that you could really relate to
Right.
on some fundamental level. The one thing I was really struck by the different stories, the more I read through the chapters, it was about how ordinary grief, trauma, and suffering is.
Right.
And it
Right.
really brought up a memoir that I read a long time ago by Michael Harrington, The Long Distance Runner, an autobiography in 1988. And he was an American democratic socialist, had a big heart. I heard him speak when I was in college, and I was always drawn to him. So he was facing imminent death by cancer,
Hmm.
and he in his memoir he says he wanted to avoid the cliches of death memoirs of dying memoirs. Instead, he wanted to face death with equanimity, with an understanding that death is ordinary and that there are lessons to be learned,
Right.
from it.
Yeah.
Uh, so what I was wondering about is the cliches of some memoirs. He wanted to avoid the cliches in his story, and he approached it in somewhat of a stoic way. Didn't want to make a big meal out of it, but he said that. But I was wondering about some cliches from memoirs that might have what might be considered predictable themes.
Hmm.
Um, for example, the damage then heal arc, or the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and trauma as a journey. Journey is such an overused word these
Right.
days.
Right.
So I was wondering if what are common cliches you have found in memoirs of trauma, perhaps the ones that you didn't want to include, and when teaching about hard writing, what advice would you give memoir writers
Well, I
about
want to
how
be
the
careful.
research
I
they
mean, I
do.
definitely do think that there are cliches that are out there, and I think that there are particular literary tropes that we
Right.
tend to kind of place on stories. Like, a lot of, you know, books kind of follow that hero's journey, right?
The
That
hero's journey, right?
start out, doing a normal thing, and then you face great challenge, but then you conquer it, and at the end, everything works out okay. And I think,
Right.
for me, those stories don't always ring true because, grief, you don't kind of face grief, get over it, and move on, right? That's not the narrative of grief that I understand or I know. And so when I read a story where somebody's like, and then everything turned out okay and I'm better now, right? I kind of want to say, well, be careful to say, be careful about that, right? So there's a
Right.
little bit of a sense of sometimes those stories don't necessarily ring true to the experience because, you can come to the end of a story. Like, for example, there's a lot in my memoir, there's a lot that's still unresolved, right? A story doesn't always have to end with neat resolution. I think that there has to be some level of growth or some level of retrospection that allows for some understanding that maybe you didn't have before you looked at the story more closely, or kind of dug into its details. But I think about people with chronic illness, for example, that can't follow that narrative journey of the hero's journey, because if you've got chronic illness, it's ongoing, right? You don't get to the end and are running in the sunset, no longer suffering. But you do get to the end and of having written that story, and there's something that you have to offer and something that you have to share. And so I think the thing that I would say, more than cliche, I think the memoirs that I kind of shy away from or that I read and don't connect with are the ones that don't feel honest, right? They're the ones that feel like the writer is either trying to be something that maybe they're not, or they're trying to attach, you know, too much of a happy ending to the story in a way that doesn't feel real, and I think people long for authenticity. They're longing for real stories that, kind of demonstrate real life, and real life isn't neat and tidy.
No, indeed not. And also it reminds me of one time I went to an art show. It was at a big convention hall, and all of the art was really perfect technically, but in my view, it lacked soul. It just
Right.
wasn't that interesting, but it was technically perfect. And so some of the things that you deal with are the question of craft versus authenticity, and how can you combine those two things? How could something be really well written, but also be authentic as well?
Well, I think it has to be both for it to be an effective story. I mean,
Right.
I think that's where the memoir genre has kind of gotten that bad rap, is that everybody kind of jumped on the bandwagon like, oh, I have an interesting story,
Right.
so I must be able to write a memoir. And then you got a lot of bad memoirs that were written because they didn't know how to write, or they didn't have the ability to take an experience that was very, very personal and create space for other people to enter with their own experiences, right? And so I think I think you do both. You have to be authentic in the sense of you're being as honest as you can on the page in terms of what the experience was, what it was like for you. But at the same time, you have to shape that in an artistic way that invites other people to be a part of it, right? So it isn't just, I'm writing this for myself and it's like my diary. It's more of shaping and crafting, because at some point in the memoir journey, and I learned this from a lot of the writers I spoke to, and then I discovered it in my own experience. At some point, you have to understand that you're not just writing about yourself, you're writing about something more collective and more community based, right? That there's something in your story that speaks to a broader story than just your own. So, for example, I'm writing about HIV, AIDS in the 1980s and 1990s. That ours was a very personal story, but it speaks to a broader cultural story, right? I'm also writing about grief and loss and family secrets and suffering and silence. And again, while ours was a very personal and distinctive circumstance, those, lots of people experience family secrets and have to suffer in silence, and the recognition of, all right, my story speaks into the questions of, what is the cost of keeping secrets? What is the cost of suffering in silence? That's a broader question than just for me to answer. It's for everybody to kind of enter in and ask that question of themselves.
Yeah, when I read that book about your father, I thought this really could be a story within that film, and the band played on
Right.
that story.
Yeah.
It yeah, it wasn't just your story. It was the story of what was going on in the 80s,
Right.
the absolute denial of even talking about it. And I think we're kind of in a moment of denial right now,
Yeah.
and lots of other things. Um, so you bring up perhaps the important elements of writing a good memoir, knowing
Right.
how to write, the
Yeah.
craft of it, the importance of self-reflection.
Right.
Uh, we're in a particular period of time where we don't like to self-reflect all that much, and so
Exactly.
you're providing that. Plus, the idea that we're not alone. And I wanted to finish with a quote from Jessica Handler, and
Hmm.
she writes, "Everybody's story is different. The way we are changed and the way we look at ourselves and our surrounding, that's where the that's where the similarity is. That's where the connection is." And your afterward really reflected this idea that the worst story that we can tell ourselves is that we're alone. What do you think about that? Can you say more
Well,
about?
well, right. I mean, I think that when we think we're the only one that's going through something, I think that it keeps us from connecting with other people, right? I mean,
Yeah,
think about how many times in your own life you've had the relief of, you know, being able to tell somebody something about yourself that you thought you were the only person going through, and that person was like, yeah, me too, right?
yeah,
Even if it's a different kind of story. And I think, I think it was C.S. Lewis who purportedly said, we read to know we are not alone. And I
right.
think that's why a lot of people are drawn to memoir, because they are true stories. There are stories that tell us something about how other people are coping with emotions that we might have felt or circumstances that we might connect with. And I think that it's so important for us to recognize as a society that, it's the connection that leads us out of isolation. It's finding those ways to connect. But it also comes with, like, I talk about, my responsibility as a memoirist is to open space, right? With my story, I'm charged with creating space for other people to bring their stories in, right? And so we have to invite other people to share their stories, and we have to look for those opportunities where we can give that invitation to other people to share their stories.
And help them see the bigger connection between their particular trauma and the trauma of life.
Exactly. I
That
mean,
that
we're in a moment right now where people's stories really, really matter, and I think that we need to be open to listening to one another and to understanding what those stories are.
Yeah. Well, look, Melanie, thank you so much. I really love your work. I love where you're taking this. Hope to see more. I don't want to put you on the spot by asking what's your next project, but I'm going to put you on the spot anyway.
Sure.
Are you thinking about some?
I'm actually thinking about a little bit of a companion to writing hard stories, actually, of doing another collection of interviews, but more about kind of what happens when we put our hard stories out into the world, kind of the risks and the realities and the rewards of that. And so kind of taking it a step further from where I spoke to these writers about, and maybe talking to other writers about it. But it's at the very initial stages, so I don't want to say too much, but that's kind of where I'm thinking about.
Well, best of luck in that, and love
Thank
to hear
you.
more as that develops. So thanks again for for this conversation. It was really fun talking with
Oh,
you.
thanks, Tony. Thanks for inviting me.